As everyone in this audience is likely aware, the first free exercise case decided by the Supreme Court in which it reached the merits of the meaning of the clause was Reynolds versus United States, which was decided in 1879, in which a Mormon polygamist who had entered into plural marriage because of religious beliefs was prosecuted on the Moral Anti-Bigamy Act, and that act, when challenged, was upheld by the US Supreme Court. What's interesting is to trace out the development of religious freedom since that time and the development of the Mormon Church since that time. So arguably, the Supreme Court's approach to the meaning of the First Amendment, while the doctrinal formulations under current law are different than that which was given in Reynolds versus United States, it's not clear to me that Employment Division versus Smith provides broader protections for freedom of religion than did Reynolds versus United States, and in fact Reynolds is positively cited in the Smith decision. So Reynolds held that religious belief was protected, religious action was not, and that any attempt to claim on the basis of religious belief an exemption from an otherwise applicable criminal statute was invalid. Mormons, however, seem to be doing quite well in American society. They're about 2% of the population. They are not subject to pervasive or brutal persecution. Their neighbors think they're weird, but think they're harmless. So how did they get to that position? So it's well known, or I hope it's well known, that Latter-day Saints abandoned the practice of polygamy at the end of the 19th century. And it's also well known that that was related in some way to what the Supreme Court decided. What I think is less well known is the sort of tortuous path towards that reconciliation. The Supreme Court's decision in 1879 did not resolve that issue for Latter-day Saints or for the federal government. In fact, the response of Latter-day Saints to the 1879 Reynolds decision was massive resistance to federal law. The Supreme Court was castigated and dismissed by Latter-day Saints, and they did not comply with the law. And the Congress replied by passing a series of laws that were designed to ramp up the amount of legal pressure that could be put on Latter-day Saints. New criminal offenses were devised to make prosecution easier. The procedural safeguards that had been afforded in the territorial courts where most Latter-day Saints were prosecuted were streamlined to facilitate prosecution. Ultimately, thousands of Latter-day Saints were either prosecuted and or incarcerated for violating anti-polygamy laws, as well as for violating other statutes, such as fornication laws, adultery laws, or unlawful cohabitation laws. So what was the shift that happened? What broke the back of Mormon resistance, if you will? The decisive shift came not with the case of Reynolds versus the United States, but with the case of late corporation of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints versus the United States, which was decided by the Supreme Court in 1890. In that case, the Supreme Court was asked to consider the constitutionality of the Edmunds-Tucker Act, which had been passed in 1887. Under the Edmunds-Tucker Act, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as a legal entity was dissolved. Mormons were deprived of the right to vote, rather all polygamous Mormons were deprived of the right to vote. All Mormons had been deprived of the right to vote under territorial statutes which had been upheld by the Supreme Court in Davis versus Beeson. And all of the property of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in excess of $70,000, I believe was the amount, was to be confiscated by the government. That money was going to be applied to the territorial schools. Applying the money to the territorial schools was not a religiously neutral act. The territorial schools were staffed and controlled by the federal authorities and were seen as a way of indoctrinating Mormons to become good American citizens. So it was at the point at which the Mormons were faced with the prospect of perpetual political disenfranchisement, mass incarceration, and institutional annihilation that in 1890 they issued the manifesto, as it is known, in which they publicly disavowed the practice of polygamy. Even so, they kept doing it in secret, okay, for at least another 15 years on an inconsistent and ad hoc basis. And the final Mormon abandonment of polygamy did not actually come in 1890. It actually came in 1902 when a Mormon by the name of Reed Smoot was elected to the United States Senate. And the United States Senate conducted a 4-year investigation of the Mormon Church and its activities. The committee conducting that investigation reached the conclusion that because Smoot was a high Mormon official and because Mormons were continuing to practice clandestine plural marriages on a limited basis, but also because they were involved in other un-American practices, that he should not be seated in the United States Senate. At that point, the Mormon church and hierarchy moved decisively to end all polygamy in the United States, but also among Mormon settlements in Canada and Mexico. The church itself began excommunicating polygamists, and it was at that point that the U.S. Senate, seeing what the actions that the Mormon church was taking, voted to reject the suggestion of the committee and seated Reed Smoot. So what you have, right, is a very long, tortured process, okay, that extends from at least the passage of the Moral Anti-Bigamy Act in 1862 up to 1907 when the United States Senate agrees to seat Reed Smoot. And what happens over the course of that period of time? The Mormons lose virtually every single court battle that they fight. They have 1 or 2 victories early on, and those victories, probably due to bad advice by the lawyers, gave the leadership of the Mormon Church an inflated sense of their possibilities of victory at the Supreme Court. They were uniformly unsuccessful in doing so. And so what did they do? They changed. Mormonism changed very dramatically over the course of the last quarter of the 19th century. As it was originally founded, Mormonism was seen as a radical restoration of primitive Christianity. As part of that, there was the sense that Mormons needed to establish an ideal Christian society, what they called Zion, and that was to take the form of an autonomous religious commonwealth in the American West. At one point in time, they tried to organize that as a separate political entity in the wake of the Mexican-American War in 1848. That religious commonwealth was not simply going to sanction the religious practice of polygamy, which had been taught by early Mormon leaders, but also was going to involve radical economic experiments. For example, would involve the withering away of the secular court system, as civil disputes between Latter-day Saints were going to be resolved within church courts, and in fact were for about 2 or 3 generations. And almost all of that was abandoned over the course of the 19th century. And the lesson that the Latter-day Saints learned was that religious freedom, as it was interpreted under American law, meant that the closer you were to essentially looking like a Protestant denomination, the more likely you were to get religious protection for your actions. And it was possible to push out from the margins of the model of a Protestant denomination, but you could not push out very far.